Hey there everybody and welcome back. I'm your host Joshua Ryan. If you grew up in the 90s like I did, then you are no doubt familiar with Jim Carrey's 1994 hit movie, The Mask. It came out at a time when Jim Carrey was at the peak of his career, with movies like Ace Ventura: Pet Detective and Dumb and Dumber. And unlike some of his other work, this one still holds up. I remember seeing this movie in theaters as a kid and absolutely loving it. It's a perfect blend of comedy and absurd storytelling. But one thing that I didn't know, and a lot of people probably didn't either, is that the movie was actually an adaptation of a comic book. The Mask was first published by Dark Horse Comics in 1991, so it was still a pretty recent comic when it was adapted for the screen. Well, I decided to give this comedy classic a rewatch and gave the original source material a read. And while both the comic and the movie are great, they are really different. So let's revisit the green-headed, cartoon-loving, unkillable Mask once more and see where these two mediums vary. Both the movie and the comic feature Stanley Ipkiss, but the Stanley from the comic and the movie share little in common besides their name. Jim Carrey's version of the character works at a job he hates. He lives in a small apartment with his dog Milo and is more or less walked all over by everybody in his life. That is until he finds a strange green wooden mask one night beneath a bridge, puts it on, and transforms. The mask essentially brings out the true desired version of the person who wears it. Stanley loves cartoons, and as the Mask, he essentially becomes a giant, walking, talking cartoon character, falling off tall buildings and flattening like a pancake. It's like watching Wile E. Coyote in a Roadrunner cartoon. Stanley is timid and lacks self-confidence, but as the Mask, he is the epitome of confidence. He walks into the club and crowds part to make way for him. He sees the girl he wants and he goes for it, and the girl he wants just so happens to be a young Cameron Diaz in one of her first starring roles. And just like Stanley is going through changes with the Mask, I think I went through some changes when I saw Cameron Diaz on the big screen for the first time. In the comics, Stanley is not nearly as likable. He's a bitter, socially awkward, and self-absorbed character. In the comics, Stanley has a girlfriend, Kathy, and she seems way out of his league. Stanley buys the mask from a shop for Kathy as a gift. He puts it on one night and of course transforms. Both versions use the powers of the mask for personal and selfish reasons at first. They are both ripped off by some scamming mechanics, and in both the movie and the comic, their first course of action is to get revenge on these mechanics. But in the movie, people don't really get hurt. And even when they do, it's done comedically and they aren't killed. For instance, movie Stanley shoves a car muffler into a very tight space of one of the mechanics, but that mechanic can still be heard moaning and crying as he's carted off by medical staff. In the comics, neither of the mechanics survive. They are left brutally murdered, which is the typical course of action for the comics. Comic Stanley even creates a hit list of all the people who have done him wrong over the years, and he uses the mask to seek out violent revenge, even against the elderly teacher who he feels was too harsh on him as a child. It doesn't matter if you are a man or woman, elderly or even a child. If this version of the mask doesn't like you, he's going to attack and even kill you. And the mask has a longer lasting effect on Comic Stanley. It's clear that his mental state is being altered, even when outside of the mask. He begins to wear only military camo and becomes verbally and physically abusive towards Kathy. The mask becomes an obsession for him. In both comic and movie, the mask attracts the attention of police, as a cartoonish, green-headed criminal tends to do. In the comics, the character is known to police as Big Head. That term is never used in the movie. In the movie, when the mask is cornered by a huge gathering of police, he narrowly escapes capture through the use of a Mamba musical number. Music begins to blast, spotlights hit him, and he's suddenly dressed in a new outfit with a set of maracas. His dance is infectious, and before you know it, the police have lowered their weapons, joined in on the song, and hopped into their place in the growing police conga line. It's a great scene, and it showcases how movie Stanley uses the powers of the mask in the silliest and yet most effective ways. When comic Stanley is cornered by police, he escapes in a slightly different way. He kills a lot of police. Like, a lot of them. And that's probably the biggest difference between these two. The comics are very violent. The blood literally spills out of the comic frames and spatters across the pages. And when Comic Stanley cannot be stopped by police, there is one person he can't escape: his girlfriend Kathy. After Stanley goes on his largest murderous rampage, he returns home, removes the mask, and plans on skipping town. But Kathy is there armed with a gun and she has other plans. She kills him. Stanley is dead. The main character from the movie is killed off really early in the comics. and he doesn't have much of a story arc. He has no driving purpose other than to introduce the mask and showcase its powers for the readers. We see him begin to lose his sanity and kill lots and lots of people who didn't deserve the violent fate they received. For the movie, we were introduced to a new character named Dorian. He's a local rising mob boss, and his girlfriend just happens to be Cameron Diaz's Tina. Dorian acts as the villain in the film, and his existence drives the plot and the character development for Stanley. It gives him a reason to wear the mask beyond just selfish causes. With the powers of the mask, Stanley stands a chance against the organized crime. It's up to him to save the day and save the girl. In fact, while comic book Stanley kills more people than I can count, Dorian is the only character that movie Stanley kills, and he does so in that typical comedic and cartoonish manner that avoids violence. He paints a giant flusher on a fountain and literally flushes Dorian down the drain. In the comics, after killing her psychotic boyfriend, Kathy gives the mask to the only person she thinks she can trust it with, the lead detective who had been hunting her boyfriend as Big Head, and he's a character you may recognize from the movie, Lieutenant Kellaway. In the movie, Lieutenant Kellaway is the lead detective chasing down the mask as well, but while in the movie he's a non-threatening, bumbling detective, in the comics he's a more stereotypical tough guy. Of course, he eventually dons the mask despite Kathy's warnings and decides to use the mask's powers as a sort of vigilante. Lieutenant Kellaway has the moral compass that comic Stanley lacked and chooses to use the mask to put a stop to crime in his city. There's a scene in the movie where Stanley Ipkiss, wearing the mask, comes across a group of generic thugs in an alleyway. He puts on a balloon animal show and slips in the dirtiest joke in the movie that you definitely didn't catch as a kid. He impresses the criminals with balloon giraffes and poodles before making a balloon Tommy gun that morphs into a real functioning gun. He fires wildly and the thugs run off, ducking, hiding, and safely jumping into a dumpster. Nobody's killed because that's how the movie operates. In the comics, it's actually Lieutenant Kellaway wearing the mask who uses the balloon animal gag against two armed robbers who just murdered an elderly store clerk in cold blood. Lieutenant Kellaway's Tommy gun is far more effective, and bullets rip through the goons, killing them both right then and there. The comic is cartoony, but it uses its cartoonish nature to combine with grotesque violence, creating a clash of typically opposing themes. The movie leaned harder into the cartoonish nature and chose to bypass most of the violence. It crafted a Stanley that audiences could relate to and root for. In the comics, Lieutenant Kellaway eventually buried the mask beneath a slab of cement because he didn't trust himself with it. He didn't like the dark places it was taking him. While he was primarily using the mask for what he believed to be good cause, he recognized that it wasn't his place to act as judge, jury, and executioner. When he nearly loses control as Big Head and turns on his old partner who's trying to apprehend him, he makes the decision to never wear the mask again. In the movie, Stanley chucks the mask into the harbor, giving it up for a normal life with the way out of his league Tina. His dog Milo, of course, has other plans and swims out to retrieve it, setting us up for a sequel that we never got. Nope, didn't happen. There was not another Mask movie. The comics continued for several more years, and there were lots of different characters to don the cursed antique. And while the comic and the movie had lots of similarities, there were a lot of differences. In the end, I think it was a smart choice to make the changes that they made for the movie, especially in the 90s. I don't think an R-rated cartoon character running around murdering everybody would have been the blockbuster that they hoped for. What do you think? Would you like to see a new movie that stays closer to the source material, or are you just happy with the one that we got? Is there another comic book adaptation that you'd like us to take a look at? Let us know in the comments. Be sure to like and follow us on Facebook, and follow me on Instagram and Twitter at MrMovieGuy86. And remember, we all wear masks, metaphorically speaking. See you next time.